Welcome to today's stream on Al-Jazeera's documentary, The Price of Oslo, which was done in 2013, which feels like and is probably a lifetime ago when we think about what has happened for the Palestinians since that time. And as I said in another stream, I actually said, I'm very glad that it's been coming up on 2 years of really studying and learning about Palestine that I am now really looking at Oslo. And that's because if I had come to Oslo pretty early and tried to read about the so called peace process, a lot of the points that were being brought up would have been lost on me. What is this right of return? Where did these refugees come from? Why is Jerusalem so important? Um, why are we trying to push? What are the settlements? I didn't know any of that stuff. I mean, I knew that the settlements existed, but I didn't know how they would play a role in the peace process. I think what's interesting here is even in 2013, the Norwegians seemed to be very proud of themselves that they'd pulled off something when all they did, well, they were proud because the Norwegians are generally pro-Israel and pro-Zionist. So of course they would be proud of that. But as far as something as a gift to the world of peace, Oslo set back a potential agreement or peace with the Israelis and Palestinians for decades, and it wasted a bunch of time. And I would argue that we saw this seduction of photo op diplomacy. So what's important is let's get the photo, let's get the handshake, let's get the smiles, let's get the Nobel Peace Prize, and then we'll work on the details. And this is the same way President Trump pretty much wants to do everything. Part of that is he has no patience. He has no desire to study the issues. He simply wants to be able to just flick a switch and everything changes. He gets his photo op. That's part of why we saw the breakdown with North Korea. For one, I remember telling people I'm very excited that something has happened with North Korea. Maybe something can change there. We can remove our troops. The Koreans can live in peace. We can get out of Asia. But I had only been learning at that point that Trump is all talk, no action, doesn't want to study the issues, doesn't want to engage in this sort of difficult negotiations it would take to make the Korean Peninsula, if not whole again, at least at peace again. So that's what's going on here is the Norwegians did display a lot of patience, a lot of willingness to work quietly, but they were doing it on behalf of the Israelis. They were passing on their notes of their conversations. They have a long conversation with Arafat. The guy writes an 11-page summary of the meeting, gives it to the Israelis. Do you think it was happening the other way around? And I didn't realize this before the documentary. Part of why Norwegians were so pro-Israel is they saw Israel as a socialist experiment, sort of socialist paradise, which harkens back to Herzl's The Jewish State and his vision that you have to realize Israel's not actually put forward as a religious state in Herzl's vision, nor in the foundation of the state of Israel and the declaration on May the 15th, 1948. It's simply this land for the Jews, and Herzl's vision is socialistic, somewhat utopian. But he had some interesting ideas. And if you want to know more, you can check out either of the reviews I've done on the Jewish state. If I remember, I'll put links to them in the description as well as cards. But the Labour Party in Norway was very involved with helping Israel. And they thought this would be a way for Israel to be helped because post 1967, Israel was definitely starting to take some hits to its reputation because the occupation was a lot more obvious now and they couldn't expel the people like they did in 1948. It wasn't so close to World War II, so they couldn't play that card that they like to play all the time. And so the PLO was weak at the time that Oslo began. There was a strategic move from the Israelis to latch on to the PLO, who themselves were looking for a win. Now, here you might step back and say, well, Stephen, what is the PLO? The PLO is is not really a ground up organization. It was Fatah, and it's big tent organization which could include people who were Islamist and people who were secular atheists who were nationalists. So the PLO is this big tent, and they didn't produce rules. If you were allied to the Palestinian National Movement, you could be part of the PLO. That was pretty much the only membership requirement. It's very a loose confederation. That's what got them into trouble in numerous of the countries that they were in. So that's why we had Black September in Jordan. The Palestinians were becoming a state within a state, and the PLO had different positions towards the King of Jordan via these different factions. Some of the factions were totally fine, very friendly with the king. Others said he needs to be overthrown, and we need an uprising so that we can have a single Arab state under a caliph. That gets them thrown out of Jordan. PLO is now in Lebanon, and you again have different factions, um, uh, some of which clash with Lebanese political movements, which then causes those Lebanese political movements to effectively invite the Israelis or be friendly with the Israelis. They get pushed out of Lebanon. And you have to understand the political context as well. If we're talking about the early 80s, the Islamic Revolution in Iran is very new. So that's 1979, where the Shah gets kicked out. And even think, you have to realize here that even the 1979 Iranian Revolution is a product of US foreign policy. The Iranian Revolution never happens if in 1953, well, I wouldn't say never, is probably unlikely to happen if in 1953 the United States doesn't coup Iran and make sure Mohammad Mossadegh is not prime minister. That 20 years of resentment and buildup lead to, when the Shah leaves to get surgery, the Iranian Islamic Revolution happens. That idea of Iran is new in that region in 79. And so when you're talking about the 80s, you have to realize the 80s are people looking at Iran and saying, well, maybe we could do that. You have 82, Sabra and Shatila, and the PLO is starting to gain some recognition. They're recognized as the sole representative of the Palestinian people by the Arab League. And there starts to be some relevancy. There's a major step back by the PLO at the time of the first Gulf War because they side with Saddam Hussein. Now, stupid for a number of reasons. No one ever accused Arafat of being a generational leader. He's not. The more you learn about him, the more you realize he was not up to the job. But he saw Hussein as someone who could support the Palestinians more, and he'd probably, I think, spoken favorably more so than other Arab leaders. The problem was a lot of Palestinians lived in Kuwait, lived and worked there, and were sending money home. But if you come out publicly as the PLO supporting Iraq during that invasion of Kuwait, then you're going to get blowback, and a ton of Palestinians were expelled from Kuwait. And the PLO were weak. And that time, early 90s, late 80s, that period of the PLO being weak and then, let's say, more ostracized, that's when the Norwegians and the Israelis came together and said, well, we can do this secret conversation in different places. And they used the cover of this organization called FAFO, which came to the West Bank to do research on, and they, I think they were a genuine research probably still are a genuine research organization to look at the economic and political conditions of the Palestinians. But while there, obviously, they say we're doing research, Palestinian leaders should come by and talk to us. And they used that time together to have deeper conversations about the issues. And what we see, and we would see also in the 91 Madrid conference where the PLO was excluded, a lack of a desire to actually work through the issues, or to publicly say we can't work through these issues because let's put the Israelis on blast, which is what the kids would say these days, and list out the issues that the Israelis will not compromise on. Instead, the PLO were so enamored of a photo op move, photo op play in which they could win something for their people, that they made this horrible deal. And as listed at the end of the documentary, well, what did we get? Well, we got 100,000 people were returned to the West Bank who had previously been expelled. But we got 20 years of settlements and ongoing slow walk Nakba. So Oslo was amazing for Israel. They got more settlements. They got more investments because the world said, oh, look at Israel doing this deal. They got more money because keep in mind, the money to fund the Palestinian Authority, which was the new agency set up by the PLO after Oslo, it had to flow through Israel. So if you wanted to send aid, Israel held the money and then distributed. Sometimes they distributed to themselves. Huge surprise. I know that's shocking. And in September 1993, when the discussions began, one of the things they said at the outset was, we are not going to discuss Jerusalem and we're not going to discuss the return of refugees. And at that point, the PLO could say, great, so that means we're not talking. Now, Edward Said, many years later, when he, not many years later, sorry, at the time that this was happening and the initial agreement came out, he said that this was not a step forward for Palestine. It was the consent of a defeated people. That I think the context Said was giving at the time was that when you have a boot on your neck for so long and all you're tasting is dirt, maybe you're hoping to just get a little bit of air and then you'll have a chance to fight back. I'm willing to give some credence to that idea. And having just read the They Called Us Enemy, I'm looking around for it. I don't know if it's at hand. But George Takei talking about how he accused his father about the internment camps. You should have stood up for us. You should have protested. And a lot of the kids who had grown up post 1948, they were having those same conversations with their parents about 1948. Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you stay? And the parents are saying, well, one day when you have kids, you'll understand how and why we acted that way. And then 67 happened. And those kids who had been complaining, they then went through their own trauma and they had understanding of what had happened. And so here too, it's easy for me, Stephen, not a Palestinian, not an Arab, not a Jew, in 2025 to say, you should have just told them, if you're not going to talk about Jerusalem and the refugees, we're not going to talk any further. Because probably that had been the idea for all of those decades. And they were looking at, it's 1993. Think about that, from 1948, how long it had been. And Mourid al-Barghouti talks about this in I Went to Ramallah, that there was always this phrase among Palestinians and the diaspora of when things clear up, because there's always incidents happening. Palestinian history is continuous. It just falls on top of each other. There's not really a period of peace. There's periods of relative quiet, but it's punctuated by violence and by displacement and horrible things. So who am I to say that in September 1993, the PLO didn't think positively, maybe we'll be able to do other things after this? So I'm not willing to say that the people who are representing the Palestinians at least were all meaning to be sellouts. It ended up being the worst possible thing that the Palestinians did for themselves in the last 50 years. But that's easy for us to say now. But we have to give grace that they probably likely thought they were doing the best thing they could for their people. And there's one example, Joel Singer, who was a lawyer working for Israel. He had 100 questions to ask the Palestinians. As always, the Israelis are very prepared. And he said, I wasn't surprised that they had answers for the questions. I was surprised that they didn't ask me a single question. And part of that was they're the weaker party. They're so keen to get the deal that they were just not in attack mode. And again, I'm trying to give grace for understanding that. I noted later on in the documentary towards the end that the deal was delivered by the Norwegians to the Americans, hand delivered on a security base, on a military base in America. Warren Christopher looks at it, hands it to Dennis Ross. Dennis Ross says, this is great. Keep in mind, Dennis Ross is a horrible creature of Zionism, right? He is an American diplomat who really just works on behalf of Israel. And he's the one who likes to use that phrase, Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think he said it on a PBS Frontline interview many, many years ago. But basically, this is all to say, if you know Dennis Ross says something is good, it is definitely bad. He's one of these creatures that if he told me that the sun was shining, I know that it's probably raining. If he told me that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I would question my knowledge of math. That's how much I distrust Dennis Ross. So him saying to Warren Christopher that this was a great deal, you had to know it was absolutely terrible for the Palestinians. For those who don't understand what Oslo was pushing towards, it was the creation of different areas within the West Bank that would eventually, the idea was eventually over time and through trust, be given back to the Palestinians. There's areas A, B, and C. So area A would be under Palestinian control and security. Area B under Palestinian autonomy and Israeli security. And then area C, Israeli control, Israeli security. But even in the way that that was mocked up, you can see Area C is mostly taken. most of the West Bank is given to the Israelis. And what the Israelis were really arguing for and have always argued for, and the closest Netanyahu has ever gotten to, is the idea of autonomy. To put it another way, the prisoners can run the prison. So if you want to be in charge of food, if you want to be in charge of water, electricity, we'll let you do that. But we're your wardens. If you want to leave the prison, you have to ask us for permission, which means you're not a sovereign country. People who are citizens of country don't need to ask government officials of another country in order to leave their own country. So what most Israelis have thought of, and this is something again I've been learning, this will come up in a review soon. Pape talks about what happened after 67, and the consensus was that we're really at best going to give the Palestinians autonomy. Remember, the overarching goal of Zionism since the 1880s in Palestine is more land, fewer Arabs. More land, fewer Arabs. You get more land through military actions, through settlements, through land grabs, through lying in the courts. And you get fewer Arabs by pressuring them out. And Oslo was a dream because they wanted to make the Palestinians their own prison wardens. The PA would be hired as a subcontractor of the Israeli occupation. And so what Oslo did was make the Palestinians ostensibly the warders of their own prison, but not even those levels of privileges. Many water, electricity, other things, the broadband spectrum. You have to realize the Palestinians are only at 3G now. The Israelis will not allow Palestinians to have 4G or 5G cell phone access. They're at 3G. They're 2 generations back. So you could say they would make them the warders of their own prison, asterisk, not really. But that's the best Oslo could offer. Oslo was offering the Palestinians an opportunity to be in charge of their own prison and to have the occupation be forever. And how the Norwegians are still proud of this so many years later is hilarious to me. Oslo, in a sense, is like the term Pontius Pilate. Right? Pontius Pilate, his name is repeated in the Apostolic Creed. And as a shame of someone who subverted justice to crucify Christ, along with the Jews of that time. And so Oslo here is associated with failure, with a lie of a peace process, a betrayal of the Palestinian people, obvious and overt Zionism. And it's a shame. Not because I don't believe in a peace process. I certainly do, but I tend to refer to it the way that Ilan Pape does, so-called peace process. So-called peace process. If you look, for example, on Palestine bookshelf and you click on the shelf and you scroll down to peace process, you'll see peace processes in quotes. Because I've come to realize that's what it is. It's a scam. I don't remember who referred to it recently. Someone watched too many interviews, but someone referred to sort of the peace industrial complex, that people just get flown around to different places. And once you get put up in 5-star hotels, you know that you're supposed to only say certain things. And so you have this endless talk about peace, but no real actions, because it comes down to these 2 points. What is the status of Jerusalem? And what is the status of the refugee return? And Israel's answer is no. No, we're not even going to discuss it. And in fact, please don't ever bring it up again. They don't even want it brought up, because if it's brought up, it means people can ask questions about it. Well, tell us a little bit more about Jerusalem. What are you talking about refugees? Where are these refugees? People who have honest intellectual curiosity will ask questions, and then Israel will have to answer. Oh, those are refugees. We expelled them during the war. Our own historians now admit to this, and only the craziest people would deny it. In fact, the most fervent among us are sad we didn't expel more people and are on the record saying it. Jerusalem is ours. It doesn't matter that Christians have lived there for centuries, that Muslims have lived there for centuries. We want to control it. We're ethnically cleansing it, and you can't do anything about it. Those would be the answers Israel would have to give if people were asking questions. And perhaps that's been the problem, is PLO is not platformed to ask these questions. And at the moment, what's happening with Hamas and Fatah is this wedge is trying to be forced in between them. And you have to realize the PLO is more than Hamas and Fatah. In fact, Hamas has been excluded since 2007 in a certain way from the functions of the PLO, apart from some unity agreements here and there. So people can think about Fatah and Hamas trying to analogize to their own political systems and think, oh, these are the only 2 political parties. There are dozens of political parties in Palestine. In fact, if you look back to the 2007 election, there were so many other parties running. That's why Hamas got, let's say, a plurality of votes, but there were lots of other parties represented as well. So the Palestinians are not locked into an either or, either Hamas or Fatah situation. But what's happening is Israel has successfully divided Hamas from that, and so people like Macron can say, but Gaza can be free, but without Hamas. This just shows you have no idea what you're talking about. Anyone who says something like that, they have no idea what Hamas is. They have no idea what the relation is to the Palestinian people, and they have no idea the role that Hamas plays in the PLO. I was one of those people at one point, but I'm just trying to point out that the idea you can have Gaza free without Hamas, Hamas has never pretended to speak for the Palestinian people. They're just speaking for the people who elected them, and they were particularly in power in Gaza. And they have said that they will respect any referendum that is put forth to the Palestinian people. You have to realize Hamas's mission, like Hezbollah, is not necessarily so focused on a particular nation state situation as it is on living Islamic values, living Muslim values, and a tie of that to a national movement. If the Palestinian people vote for something in which Hamas is not included, Hamas says that they will accept that. Hamas was a resistance movement. It didn't form itself to govern, become a political party. It just happened that way through things that the Israelis and the US did. All right, I'll shut up for a moment and answer some chats here. No super chats yet because our channel's not monetized. So, do factions of the Israeli ruling class ever carry out authentic negotiations, or are the negotiations always rug pulls and time wastings? So, great question, Didymus. Prior to October 7th, there was a dead or dying leftist peace movement in Israel. Afterwards, even the leftists were militarized. Gideon Levy talks about this in The Killing of Gaza. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. But he says a lot of these peacenik leftists were saying, "Oh no, now we have to." I've woken up from my dream. I've woken up from my delusion. So when you say factions of the Israeli ruling class, it would assume that any of the major parties in the Knesset have peace as some aspect of their platform. No. The way that Israel's political makeup is now is such that I want you to imagine a moderate in Israel would say the settlements need to be a little less brutal and a little slower. And the most leftist potentially, and I'm talking about major parties. I'm sure, I'm sure there are people in Israel, honestly, who are opposed to the settlements. I've met some of them. So I don't want to smear them that way. But politically, there's not a will to deal with the settlements. That's the other aspect of this. I talked about Jerusalem, I talked about return of refugees, but the settlers are there occupying land that doesn't belong to the state of Israel as recognized by international law. But a lot of those settlers are empowered through religious fervor that it is all their land. And in fact, this is the minimum. When they're looking at that map back there, that's the minimum. They're actually looking to move into what they call Transjordan. They won't call it Jordan. We're going to move into Transjordan. We're going to move into Egypt. We're going to move into Lebanon. We're going to move into Syria. We need more Lebensraum, to use a phrase of previous decades, with no irony. But they need more Lebensraum. And so there are no authentic negotiations going on because keep in mind, even what I'm referring to, Oslo, this was all secret until it had gotten to an advanced enough stage that they could bring in Shimon Peres and then Rabin. And then Rabin gets assassinated by a Jewish terrorist, by his own people, because he was seen as a betrayer. Even trying to give the Palestinians the keys to their own prison, that's a compromise. Because really what they want is they want the Arabs gone. And keep in mind, they want the Arabs gone from every land that they take. So let's say they flee across the border to Jordan. Well, when they take over Jordan, they want them gone from that too. They have to be cleared out. This has to be a pure Jewish space. So my answer to that is no. So we say rug pulls and time wasting. There are no negotiations happening. So there are no rug pulls and time wastings in recent years. I think Madrid in 91 and I think Oslo, yes. And then the sort of panic, Camp David, Taba River, all of those were they all rug pulls? They were just trying to get around the issues. And finally, Arafat had seen things had gotten much worse for the Palestinians since all of the agreements he signed, and the documentary shows it, 93, 95, 97. They show him signing all these documents, and nothing gets better for the Palestinians. Really, things get much worse. And the Palestinians reacted with the Intifada. That was their reaction to all the time wasting. You're going to do this to us? We're done with this. We're going back to resistance. And you have to realize ultimately that's at the heart of understanding the PLO's situation. And same situation for Hamas, the same situation for Hezbollah. How can I conduct moral, rightful, just resistance to an unlawful, immoral occupier while also trying to engage in a political process that gives me legitimacy with the rest of the world and shows that I am not just a quote unquote terrorist? That is a very difficult line to tread by the most capable of individuals. Palestine has not been blessed by capable leadership. Going back to Haj Amin al-Husseini at the time of the revolt, and part of why that's on my mind is because I've been reading Hassan Kanafani lately, and I've been reflecting more on the Grand Mufti and him as an original failure in Palestinian leadership. But I would attribute more goodwill to al-Husseini than I would, in a sense, to Arafat. I feel Arafat got really complacent, got really corrupt, and really tried to use the traditional Arab head man philosophy. I'm in charge of everything, and I'm going to make these corrupt moves. And then the PA took on his personality, and that's a discussion for another time. But that threading the line of resistance and negotiation and winning at both is a task that would be difficult for the very best leaders. And Palestine has not been blessed with those leaders, or if they've had people speaking up. Edward Said, I think, was at Madrid. Rashid Khalidi, they've been ignored, pushed to the side, say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand political expediency. Well, Didymus, so I'll read this comment. Never knew the settlements were legitimized by Oslo. When we say legitimized, what we mean is there was no action taken against them. In fact, we saw more settlement building against the protest at that time of the United States. And keep in mind, to this day, it's still official U.S. policy. It has not even been renounced by Trump that the settlements are illegal. The idea of legitimization is that they were not brought up as a sticking point. Oslo was celebrated, And then what did Israel do with that celebration? They built more settlements. They've always built more settlements. They've been building settlements since 67. And you can argue they've been building settlements since 48 because, they took over land that they shouldn't have taken. Discussion I'm happy to have sometime. This helps me understand Oslo. Leo, in a sense, there's not much to understand, but I will be covering books later this year that go a little more surgically into the process and unpack some conversations. But Oslo was a big scam. That's really what it was. No, there's no evidence of this. So, so the question that Leo has is: did Arafat really turn down a Palestinian state, as the Clintons allege? Keep in mind, first of all, this is Bill Clinton. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. This man won't tell the truth about himself. Why would I believe what he would say about the Palestinians? So he is a questionable character, Clinton. But if that were true, all we would need would be a recording or a piece of paper showing that he was handed this and he was refused. That's always the question. The Palestinians turned down all of these great offers. They've turned down a state, I've heard 5 times. If that's true and the Israelis want us to believe it, just show us the evidence. Just show us the evidence. And it wouldn't matter to me anyway, insofar as just because the Palestinians were offered a state doesn't mean that they're obliged to accept it on any terms. Because how the Israelis might define a state is not how you and I might think of a state. So that's not a deal breaker for me. But what is a deal breaker is alleging that someone was offered a state. If you got 5 times, you have no one in the room who's willing to offer eyewitness testimony other than Clinton, who's trying to protect his legacy, say, I didn't screw this up. Because Clinton, like Trump, is trying to move along difficult things quickly so he can get a photo op, so his legacy can be assured. These are not people who have real skin in the game. Clinton didn't have any real skin in the game. Trump doesn't have any skin in the game, either in Korea or in Gaza, where he wants to build a big, lovely, beautiful resort. Look at all that wonderful beachfront property. This kind of stuff takes patient negotiation. And one of the things they alluded to in the documentary is, we worked all this out over a 7-hour phone call. Like, that was some great accomplishment. How about 7 months of discussions, negotiations, which I think I'd be happy to have a daily briefing of, showing the intransigence of the Israelis and the reasonableness of the Palestinians. Can people return to the homes they were expelled from? Can we have a state in which the Israelis are not welcome? There are all sorts of things that can be worked out. But what has happened since Oslo, in a sense, soured, I think, the world on the so-called peace process. They bought into the propaganda of Oslo, and then when it went south, they hadn't done enough research to find out why did it go south. And then they saw the violence, and they wanted to blame the Palestinians. Even though in the days of that intifada, it was seen how brutal the Israelis were. And the irony was that who was David and who was Goliath in this situation? The irony was not lost, it turns out. I wasn't really paying attention in that time period of the Second Intifada. I was in high school at the time, and I had a Syrian friend in high school, but we didn't talk too much about it. I even at the time of high school, I thought something isn't right here about what was going on, but I really didn't investigate any further. That's on me. But if there were evidence of it, just as you remember, the Israelis say that the Palestinians were told to flee Palestine by their leaders in 1948. Where is the evidence? If there were evidence for this, then we would believe it. Benny Morris, Zionist, has says there is no such evidence. The British were monitoring the radio waves. There was no call. And in fact, he provides in footnotes of the Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, he provides footnotes of counterexamples, endnotes rather, in which members of the Arab Legion forced Palestinians back to their villages at gunpoint and said, do not leave. If you leave, you won't probably be allowed to come back. So the Israelis just tell lies. And fast forward to today, beheaded babies, mass rapes. They tell lies. The world accepts these lies before investigating them. And then later on, when these lies are debunked, people have already moved on to whatever their favorite television show or whatever favorite movie it is that they're watching. Who cares about dead Arabs? Nobody cares. Certainly not America, who enables the killing of those Arabs. All this was mystifying as a kid and young person. Now it's obvious why. It's all dishonest political theater and exploitation. I mean, Didymus, I mean, it's in a certain sense, it's all when is political theater not political theater? I'll be doing a book review on my main channel in about a couple months' time, still working through elements of it. But on the gunpowder plot, gunpowder plot is one of the original false flags, original framing of a group of people, in this case, Catholics. Look at these horrible Catholics. They were trying to blow us up. There was no such thing happening. It was all a frame up by Cecil and the Protestants in order to demonize Catholics, to create a holiday that's still celebrated today. That's a false flag. Um, that's a discussion for another time and another channel, actually. Let's keep it on the Palestinians. It is Palestine Bookshelf. And on Oslo, if you have any questions about Oslo, peace process, or general questions about Palestine, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the stream for today. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to stop by. If you haven't watched the documentary, it's in two parts, should be linked in the original description of this video. Please take the time to watch them, even if Oslo is as much of a scam as what I've been putting forward in this stream. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn the information. All information is valuable. All truth is valuable. It all is part of a mosaic that helps you understand things better. And when you're up close putting the mosaic together, it doesn't look clear. But as you start to do that, and then you're able to step back and say, oh, okay, where are the holes in my knowledge? Umberto Eco talks about this idea of the anti-library, that a library sometimes can represent holes in my knowledge. These are things I would like to know. So choose the case with Palestine Bookshelf. As you put together some of these bits of knowledge and you're able to step back, and then you can say, gosh, I don't know too much about the settlements. I should study that more. I don't know too much about the role of Egypt. I should study that more. What's going on with Lebanon and Hezbollah? I should study that more. Why is Syria so important? I should study that more. Why did King Hussein make a secret deal with the Israelis to not really fight in 1948? I should study that more. So thanks for the stream. Good show. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you for everyone else who stopped by. Please keep the conversation going in the comments. If you're coming to this after the live stream, put comments, questions, happy to answer them. And we've got a lot of great people on the channel, and I think they'll probably contribute as well. But thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.